All right, Celia. So I have a few questions here I just wanted to ask you. When we design games, right, it's easy to come up with a good idea, and it's easy to imagine how it would play out in your head. But it's one thing to actually, when you put it in front of players, actually make it that engaging experience that you wanted it to be. In your opinion, how does user experience, the testing and the things that you do, how does that actually make that a reality?
Sure. Well, that's a very good question. Ideas are pretty cheap, right? Everything is all about the implementation and how you can accomplish the experience you have in your mind. And this is the tricky part. And a video game is a very complex product, and it's interactive. There's a lot of different people who can play. And the tricky part is that because there's that interaction, it's not like a movie. Even if you don't quite understand what's going on, the movie is still all going on for you. In a video game, you're the one who's playing it. You're the actor in there. So this is why it's even more important to think about user experience. And what is user experience is what is it like for the player to interact with the game from end to end, and even you can think about the experience outside of the game. How is it like to download the game? All this experience as well. This is really important.
So it's not just internal parts of the game, it's also how the game is represented in the external world.
Yeah, user experience is about everything, like from marketing, from like the technology, from how you interact, like everything from end to end when you interact and play the game. This is user experience has to take into account everything.
And that's even from how a button click when you press it, right? What is displayed on screen, how it actually relays information to the player,
Yeah,
like
so
everything, right?
this is what we call signs and feedback, and this is one of the crucial elements in your game. Like everything in the game, when the player is doing something, it has to have a feedback from that action. That's like, when you go into an elevator and you want to choose your floor, if you click on the third floor, for example, it's not lighting up, what do? You mash that button, because we used to have a feedback from the system to tell us that, okay, the system knows what I want to do. It acknowledges my actions. So this is really important in a game.
I actually teach a game mechanics class over here, and I actually teach affordances, and one of them that I use, false affordances, which is when something looks like it should do something and it doesn't. So the closed door button in the elevator, right? For those who don't know, it's only for...
That's just an American thing. In France, it does work.
Well, it works too, but it's only when the firefighters come in and they turn the key. But because you can see it, right, all the players, which are the people they want to click in, it's like, or press it and it's not working. So, I mean, that's UX in real life too, right? So when you do a typical UX session, can you tell us a little bit about the details, like how many people, how long, what type of metrics you have on people?
Okay, so that's a very broad question, actually, because there's no really typical UX session. There's always a question you need to answer. There's an hypothesis. And depending on what the question is, this is what is going to define the methodology. So there's no template that you would use for every time you have to do a test. So if the question is, can people understand my icons, then you can just do a survey with the icons separately out of context to see how self-explanatory they are. If it's all about how people understand the onboarding of the game, then you would bring a few people. You don't need to bring a lot of people, because it's all about finding usability problems. It's not about understanding, gauging the opinions of the people. It's about looking at their behavior. So you don't need to have a lot of people, but you would typically I would bring 4 or 5 people, depending on the game, and we just look at the people playing. Sometimes we give them a specific task to see if they can accomplish it, or we just let them play, and we see where are the friction points and where they actually don't see something, or they don't understand something, they get lost or get frustrated, and we will do a report from that to remove all the friction points that are not part of the experience. And this is really important to emphasize, because there's a lot of misconception about UX, and one of the most common is like people are afraid that because of me, the game is going to be easier to play, and well, I'm gonna distort the design intentions. This is not what I'm doing, I promise. We're just here to understand what the experience is and make sure to remove all the friction that is not about the experience. So if your game is a hardcore game like Dark Souls, it's all about make players suffer, it's okay, we'll get there, but we will remove the friction that is not about the experience intended.
And when you do that, do you have any tools like eye trackers, for instance, or do you guys prefer to be in a separate room and watch them, or do you have like one moderator typically when you're playing like a game?
Yeah, you're talking about the fancy biometrics.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, depending on what you're testing. For a typical session, like the most common ones, I would have observers in the room with the players. I would have one observer for 2 players because it's very hard to observe players, and they're the ones who code the behavior. They have a grid predetermined, so they can say, okay, this is not working, this is working, they actually did it, like they did craft an item or they did not understand how to do this. So it's predetermined depending on what we're testing. And typically I would be behind the one-way mirror and talk with the developers and see what they think about it, because it's really important to have the developers there, because they can actually see where the players are happy and where they're frustrated. If you see it really firsthand, it is really different from just receiving the report.
So you say you want them to actually be there, not just a recorded thing.
Yes.
Okay, that's good.
I want them to feel the pain. Yeah, I'm a bit sadistic. I'm joking. And to go back to your question about biometrics, sometimes we will use eye tracking is the one we use so far at Epic Games when it makes sense. It's really actually interesting to see whenever there's pop-ups on the screen to see if actually people are gazing at it. Although it's not because people are gazing at it that they're paying attention to it, because it's not measuring attention, it's just measuring the gaze. So it's still not always easy to use eye tracking. But it can be useful to see if actually something is seen or not.
Okay. Typically, when you talk about the type of people you would use in a user experience test, you would assume it's people who are fans of the game or people in that targeted demographic. Is there a reward in the data of having someone outside of that demographic? Like, do you sometimes bring in people, have a survey or something, and see if they know absolutely nothing about the game you're testing? Is that valuable?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So user experience has 2 big buckets: the user and the experience. So it's really important to understand what experience is intended, but it's critical to know who your audience is going to be, because you're not going to test the game the same way. So usually we do like persona methodology to determine who is really our core audience, and then we have a second persona that's someone who would easily come into our game. But it's also really interesting to, depending on the game, if you have a game for a broad audience, it's really important to see how people would interact with the game. Although, I mean, if you have an RPG game that has specific codification, you're not gonna bring in people like that are not playing that sort of game. So you would bring people that are already interested in these games or know these games. Then it's good to have people that are not specifically interested in your game, but are playing the same types of games.
Okay.
So if you're doing a shooter game, bringing people playing shooters, but not necessarily people who already heard about your game. And actually, it's even better if they don't know what the game is, and if they don't know. For us, it's difficult because we bring the people at Epic Games, so they know it's going to be an Epic game. So they're already all excited to play the game. But it's better if the people don't really know about the game, so sometimes they're going to try to please you and to search more than they would do at home.
Right. Do you guys ever do testing for different, let's say, like language markets? Because different countries will have different trends in gaming, and maybe there's people who are fans of FPS in one country who would play it differently. Does that ever show up?
There's not a ton of difference within the Western countries. There are some differences between Asia and the West. Usually you would ask, if you have a partner in Asia, you would ask them to take over that part of the research because it's difficult. I mean, how can you do that? You have to bring over people from that demographics to play your game. And if you're in the US, it's hard to have the people like who are Asians and live there to play your game unless you have some way to test there.
Okay.
But you have to take that into account for sure because there are cultural differences and colors, symbols. So this can be critical depending on the scope of your game.
The one most obvious that I find is just from Western to Eastern, the X and circle on PlayStation. They swap those out. Cultural differences. So you've mentioned that you're interested in educational games for children. Is there anything you can elaborate upon that?
Sure. This is how I started, actually. So I got a PhD in psychology, and I'm specialized in child development. And so this is how I started to work in the industry by actually working for educational toy company named VTech. And so I started to design and adjust and adapt toys and video games, educational video games for kids for the French market. And this is when I realized that there's still a lot of things psychologists could bring in that area because there's a lot of games and toys who want to be educational, but it's not that easy. It's not because you put numbers and addition and subtraction that you can claim being educational. It's actually a very complex problem, and there's a lot of researchers working on that because there's a problem that we call transfer of learning. Sometimes you would learn something within the context of a game, but you want the children or even adults to be able to transfer what they learn into other situations, other contexts. And this is what is really educational. And this is hard to test, this is hard to accomplish. So it's a very broad question. And I've been working with researchers such as Fran Blumberg. She's really working hard to find out how we can improve games to make them more educational. But it's not easy. And I would argue that educational games would learn a lot from UX because even like entertaining games, it's already hard to sell. It's hard to engage people and players because there's a lot of games out there. And it's even harder for educational games because usually these games don't have a lot of budget. They don't have UX labs. But still, these games have to be engaging because otherwise, like the children or the adults are not going to be in the flow of that game, and so they're not going to learn that much. And then they have to have transfer. So
right. Yeah, I actually come from a background doing serious games, so I know what you're talking about with the small teams, no testing.
Yeah.
And then you're not even sure if people are actually learning the objectives that you put in. Speaking about serious games, do you feel that it's more effective to make a game with the entire objective is like, this is a serious game, we meant to teach you something, or maybe working into disguising it as a real game, having some sort of educational crossover? So for instance, like the Typing of the Dead, if you know that game, it's meant to be a game, but you end up being a really good typer at the end of it. So people who went in didn't buy it saying, I'm going to learn how to be a better typist, right? So which design do you like more?
Again, it all depends on who's the user and what experience you want to intend. Sometimes it's difficult because your user is not necessarily the people who you're going to sell the game, because it might be parents. So you have to talk to the parents, so they are the ones going to buy the game, and their children are like, I know what you're doing. You're trying to make me learn something. But learning is a playful experience by itself. The problem is that when you have it as an intrinsic motivation, this is when it's starting to be more boring, and which is weird because babies, they play, and this is how they learn. So that's the reason why I like to use playful learning instead of serious games. And I usually, when I'm asked that question, I usually take the example of Seymour Papert. I don't know if you remember that. I am a little old, but he's the one behind the Logo programming language. Have you heard of that? Remember a little turtle? We have that go
That's
to
what I started
50.
on.
Yeah. And he designed this game to have children learn about geometry, and they had another version for grammar and English. But he thought, and it was back in the 60s, this guy was just a genius. He thought that the children had to program the computer instead of having the computer teach the children. And by having the children manipulate the turtle, they have, well, if they have to draw, for example, a square, the children had to figure out what are the characteristics of a square. And by trying and failing and redoing the drawing, this is how they learn. And that was genius, and we still have to learn a lot from Seymour Papert. And we're in 2015 now, and we still have to get there and make sure that the children can actually program the computer, or they can have elements that they have to manipulate themselves to accomplish something.
Bringing it back to the UX side of things, are there products that you see on the market right now, talking in the game space, that you think are an excellent example of how UX should be done, that you didn't work on, that you think our students should check out and study?
So just to be clear, there's no terrible game and there's no perfect game. There are a lot of games out there with good and bad examples for UX. So it's hard because I'm going to pinpoint a good example, but it doesn't mean that other games don't do it. So for example, Uncharted 2, they have a very good way to introduce the player to the controls. They do what I call learn by doing, in context, and add meaning. So you always learn better for interactions stuff if you learn by doing. So it means that in a game, when you have all the instructions just written on screen, but you cannot actually do it, this is not in context. You cannot do it while you see it. But games like Uncharted 2, they don't tell you, first of all, if you move by yourself at the beginning of the game, they don't tell you to use the thumbstick to move. So it's dynamic. And then, so I don't know if you remember, but you're at the bottom of the train and you have to climb up. The train is like hanging up from a cliff, otherwise you're going to die. So you have a real motivation as a player to get off that train and to find the way out, because otherwise you're going to die. And so they put you in a really interesting meaning. So there's a meaning in what you're learning, like navigation. And at that moment, you climb up the train, and there's a gap, you have to jump. And this is where they tell you, press X to jump. So it's in context, you can do it while you taught, and there's a strong meaning because you know why you have to jump right now, because you have to climb up the train and get out of here. So that's a good example, like give context and meaning.
Sorry. So do you feel maybe games nowadays, because we hear a lot of times about the complaints of the people who have been following a series from the beginning, they still have to go through the tutorial, right? Do you feel there should be ways to organically make them subvert that, or is there a trick you can use to make it where if you can maybe test someone in the game in a way, test them and see if they already are used to the control scheme and used to how to play it, and make them like bypass an area?
Yes, absolutely. It all comes down to the constraints, resources, what engine you're using, how much time you have. Because, I mean, if we hold out all the resources of the world and all the time of the world, I mean, all games would be perfect at some point.
Right.
But if we have to deal with these constraints, so there's always trade-offs. If your tutorial tips can be dynamic, so if the system can recognize that the player is already doing something, then you don't have to teach him. Like, for example, if at the beginning of the game you tell the player, hey, look up, if depending on how the player is using the thumbstick to look up, you don't have to tell him how to invert the axis, because the system can recognize, okay, it pushed either down or up to look up, and so this is what we're going to use for the player. So these dynamic tutorials are the best, just telling when the player is not doing it, but that's more difficult to do. What you can do, usually when I ask the designers, is to list all the things that the player has to learn and what are the really most important things for your game. And we prioritize that, and we make sure that really what's on the top priority is really what is super important for the experience of the game to learn, to enjoy the game. And then the rest, all the trade-offs, we put down, because if you try to teach everything, that's going to be too much. And then from there, we can have players coming over and see, do they discover this by themselves or not? And so with that information, you can rearrange the prioritization, and then you focus on the things that are more important and that players did not discover by themselves. And then this is how you actually put together your onboarding and your tutorial tips.
So when you said resources, having all the resources, a lot of our students, when they graduate, they might actually make the jump, the risky dive into indie, making their own studio, maybe joining a small one. For those type of groups who have zero budget and just a few people, maybe a few friends, are there maybe some tips you could give, or maybe any resources online where they could do their own UX testing amongst their small sample size?
Sure.
With no budget.
Yeah, sure. So a lot of people tell me, but I don't have the time, I don't have the money to do that, I cannot afford it. But ask yourself, can you afford not doing UX? Because if you don't do UX, apply UX processes, you're actually going to take more time to finish your game. And when you ship it, this is when you're going to see all the problems. And so if you have a lot of UX problems, your game is not going to sell that well. So it's actually just an investment of time and a little bit of money. But you can do it with not that many resources. Like first, learn a little bit about the brain and how it works. I don't tell you that you don't need to get a PhD, but just get an understanding of how the brain perceives, so perception, attention, and memory. If you there's a few books out there, it's actually pretty easy to find. If you just get an understanding of these concepts and how the brain works, it's going to actually help you when you're going to design. Then try to find some people, when you iterate, very early in the iterative process, try to find some people that would be part of the audience but don't know anything about your game. If you pick a friend, the problem with friends is they don't want to hurt you. They don't want to hurt your feelings, and the human being is very biased. So it's better to have maybe a friend of a friend that don't really know you, don't know the game. So that would be better. And try to stay away from perception and stay away from opinion from that person, and just look at what is it doing. So if you show, for example, an icon, don't ask the person, do you find that clear? Ask the person, what do you think this is? What do you think this is doing in the game? Ask really precise questions and ask people to do something so you can actually see what they do, what they understand, and not really what they say about it and their opinion, because this is more biased. So that can help you really greatly. You can do that by yourself.
And you recommend the best way to document the data, just like a spreadsheet of some kind? Is there a preferred way to?
Well, if you're indie, you're not going to do any sorts of documentation. You're just going to see the problem, fix it, retest it, fix it. And then once it's good to go, you're going to... So think about paper testing. This is very cheap. There's a lot of things you can do with paper. It's not going to cost you a lot. You can test with a few people here and there and nail it down before you actually implement it. And after you implement it, you can test it again. But this is going to save you a lot of time and a lot of money, because if you iterate after it's implemented, it's more work. I forgot your question. You forgot it too.
Oh, I thought you said you've got a question. Is that what you said? Oh, you forgot.
No, I
the
was
question. Okay.
forgetting where I'm going with that.
So the question was, are there any resources like maybe a website of some kind?
Oh yeah, no, you were
software that
actually
they
talking
can
about
use?
how you document it. Yeah, you don't really need to document it. If we only document it because we are outside of the team and we're trying to keep track of the problem. So we would use spreadsheet, or we would give a report. Usually we always try to put videos to show how people were interacting rather than just explaining.
Okay. And I imagine from being in quite a few sessions, there's got to be times where the designers all thought they nailed this part of the UX, and they knew the testers would have no problem with that section. And then maybe as soon as the first 5 testers, maybe everyone ran into the problem. Have you ever had maybe some like instances you can share about where what you guys thought would be an easy to comprehend portion of the game, and then just totally defied your expectations?
Yeah. Well, most of the time we can anticipate a lot of problems, and then there's some stuff we didn't think about. So I can think of an example on Fortnite, and we had. So in that game, you have a lot of assets, and one of the assets is just a decoration asset, has electric sparks in there. And in one of the modes that we were testing, the player has to connect a generator to a machine, and so you had nodes to place from the generator to a machine to activate the machine. And the problem, and we did not expect that, it's always common sense after the fact, but before the fact is harder. We saw a lot of players actually, they saw this decoration asset, so no gameplay value of that asset, but because it had electric sparks, well, hey, electricity, this might be the generator. And so we saw them for 10 to 15 minutes trying to connect that asset as just decoration to the machine, and they were all around it because it's a co-op game, so the 4 players are around it talking to each other. Okay, try to place another one right in between. The spark maybe is gonna work, and we were all like devastated looking at that because the artists, they just want to create cool stuff, which is awesome, but sometimes you don't expect that it's gonna go against gameplay, and this is where it's more tricky. Now, after the fact, yes, this is where you were talking about false affordances. There you go. But you don't necessarily think about it beforehand. Yeah.
And we're going to open up the floor to some questions real quick. One thing I did want to say, we might need your help here on campus. Over on one of our buildings, on Building 5, and you'll understand this completely. There's a bathroom door that has a big metal push area all the way across.
Okay.
And that's it.
Okay.
Do you see just all the way across? That's it. That's the whole door.
Okay.
So you have no idea if you push on the left or on the right side, right?
Oh, I see.
So that's a UX problem in the real world, right?
Yeah, you mean like we should have just cut...
Just half of one, right? Yeah. So I wonder how many people, when they go to that door, they push in the center and they think it's going to come up, right?
Working. Oh, yes, this is there.
All right, does anyone have any questions? Right there. We got a mic coming out to you.
It was actually really interesting to find out that you have a background in educational games. Me and one of my colleagues at school were actually talking about how they don't really implement real types of education into a traditional game, and it's kind of a waste considering the fact that you learn so much about systems and UIs in that game. Could be like, how could you implement it? One of the ideas I just kind of came up with is like if a Fallout game was set in another country and half the language is in that native country, right? And it'd be contextual where like if you see an orange on the street, it would be that language's name for an orange, and you might be able to pick up 500 words per se by just walking around constantly seeing things and knowing, hey, I've seen that 50 times. I know that's an orange. It's in some language I don't understand, but because I've seen it so many times, I now know like 500 words in a new language. And they don't use things like that in real games, just kind of passively because you're interactively dealing with things, kind of like a child, right, when you're growing up. Do you see things like that moving forward, becoming more mainstream, us trying to slide things into there, being like, hey, let's teach you something. Let's give you a real life skill when you get out of this game?
I mean, like incidental learning.
Yeah.
Yeah, like games like Assassin's Creed. This is exactly what they're trying to accomplish. You know, you're playing that badass assassin, but you're in an environment that is actually historical. So yeah, well, I can always think when I was working in educational, I found funny that my nephews told me that they now they know the how the country flags of different countries from the soccer video games they were playing. So yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of information and a lot of things that you can learn through games just by incidental learning. So yeah, I mean, it always, we don't have to do it, but if you want to bring that to players, there's always a way to do it, and that has a great value indeed, because this is easier to transfer to real life. So yeah, I certainly hope so.
All right, anybody else? All right, right there.
How did your education, how did that feed into learning what to do on user experience, and how did it help you with your job?
Sure. Well, the research part of my education is really what helped me out. Because what is really important in my job is not to bring another opinion, because designers, the dev team in general, already has a lot of opinions to deal with. So what I have to do is to bring facts from science, how the brain learns, how the brain works, and also to bring an analysis from data. So I use two things. I use my knowledge of the brain, my knowledge of psychology, cognitive psychology, and I use my knowledge of how to test things. So I use the scientific methodology. Even like all we do is not completely science, because we're not in a research lab. We have to ship, so we cannot do it as, it's rigorous, but it's not as rigorous as real research. But we know how to limit the biases. We know how to construct a methodology based on a hypothesis. So that knowledge and that know-how helped me greatly to conduct the research and to present also the information back to the dev team, and to make sure that I explained to them the limitations, what we saw. So yes, this was really like the analytical part was really useful for me to go into user research.
Oh, we got a few more.
How would you recommend students get involved in stuff like this so that whenever we graduate, we could transition to user research?
That's a good question. I think if you're interested into user research, this is becoming very trendy in the industry. And now there's a lot of demand people don't really know what they really want. It's always like we're looking for UX designers, but they don't necessarily understand what it is, or interaction designers, or UX researchers, and it's still a bit fuzzy who does what. But there's a real interest into UX now, so it shouldn't be too hard to transition. But what you really need to have is so first be a listener. Understand what the problems they have to solve, so you can come here and help them solve these problems with your knowledge and your know-how. So this is what you have to have: some knowledge of cognitive psychology, human factors, and know-how to conduct research. If you know how to do that, then you can help teams if you listen, and if you make sure that you're here to serve the experience, and to serve the audience, and to serve the game and the team. So this is what you have to do. Now, if you look more into UX design, you have to have a background in design, interaction design, and stuff like that.
All right. Next question.
Hi, Celia. So I've been noticing that there's a trend in gaming now where it's more and more likely that people are going to be releasing like a beta or an alpha, or now like pre-alphas and stuff. I actually kind of have two questions. The first is, do you think that that's a good thing for the industry, that they're putting the game out sooner to let people play it, like, before anything else? And as a UX person, do you feel that makes your job easier, harder? Does it give you more work to do, or like how does that affect you?
More work. Yes, it's absolutely critical to test the game before you ship it, because this is where you see the problems. And I mean, it's funny because in the video game industry, we're asking that question where, I mean, you wouldn't ask that question to someone who's designing a car. You would want that person to test the car with real users before you ship it, right? And this is the same thing with video games. You don't want to burn all your audience. You want to have a smaller subset of your audience who are going to be here to help you out. And it's actually really important to share and to be open with the communities who are going to help you out growing the game. So you have to be transparent and understand that how precious this is. But you definitely want to test as soon as possible. And the sooner, the better, because even if you're not opening it to thousands or millions of people, even with a few hundred at the beginning, you're going to see where the problems are, like right on. And if you do that early, you can then reiterate and see how this is evolving for a game. So yeah, of course, it's more work because it's not only UX testing in the lab, but it's also think about analytics, because you don't want to track everything what's going on. You want to track these things that are going to be very useful for you, and once you have the result, you can act upon it right away. So it's also part of the process to discuss with the team, say, okay, what hooks do you need? So you can have good analytics back, and how do you want this visualized? So as soon as you see it, you can actually act upon it and then tweak it and see when we retest if it's fixing the problem. So yeah, it's a lot of work. I mean, if it was easy, I mean, everybody would do it, and I would be out of job. So it's definitely not easy. It's super complex to make a video game. It's always about choices you have to make. There's always trade-offs. So yeah, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of sweat. But when you see the game progressing, that's immense reward of seeing, yeah, now we got that part. It's working. It's really so rewarding that you keep going. It's like a drug.
All right. Thank you guys for your questions. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank everybody for showing up, and I especially want to thank Celia for coming out and talking to us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, thank you.